to be here with you this morning. If you're visiting with us, we are honored that you're here. If you have a Bible, I'd love for you to open up to the book of Genesis chapter 40. We'll be in Genesis 40 and Genesis 41 this morning. We're in a series called The Life of Joseph. And the idea behind this is to look through an amazing Old Testament man that really we start his story when he's a teenager. And we get to basically see his life through his death, very, very old. And he goes from being the favored of his family, living a very privileged life, to being sold into slavery. Last week we looked, he was bought by a man named Potiphar, who was the captain of Pharaoh's guard. His wife Potiphar's wife took a liking to Joseph, essentially accused him of rape. He was put into prison. And that's where we kind of pick up our story this morning. The whole premise behind this is, how do you and I grow through life's detours? Life will throw us curveballs. It throws us things that we're not prepared for necessarily, but you and I as Christians still have to be able to move forward. Joseph has endured a lot up until this point. Again, he's sold into slavery. Now he's thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit. And so now he finds himself hundreds and hundreds of miles away from home, again in a pagan land, but now he's in prison. And this is where he was placed and where we're going to start looking in Genesis 39, starting in verse 20. Genesis 39, starting in verse 20. This is just to kind of get us up to speed, and then we'll pick up from where he is in prison. Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Now, I want you to focus in on this. And he was there in prison, but the Lord was with Joseph. He was in prison, but the Lord was with him and showed him steadfast love, gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. I want you to imagine yourself being Joseph. He's probably in his mid-20s at this point. He's been thrown into prison, and he's having to yet again start from nothing after a major detour in his life. You know, I think he probably figured something to the extent of, okay, life threw me kind of a rough hand. My brothers, they didn't treat me well. I got thrown into slavery, but I'm glad I found Potiphar. Right, Potiphar bought me. I've now risen to basically being his number two guy. I am still a slave, but I've got a pretty okay life with everything considered. I'm going to, ride this out, do as best as I can. I'll continue to serve God, and this is God's plan for me. Must be. Then this happens. He gets thrown into prison and has to start back from nothing. Seemingly no favor, no anything. Yet Scripture tells us explicitly that God was with Joseph. A lot of times I think we say something to this effect. If God were with me, I wouldn't be where I am right now. This comes a lot of times right after a detour happens. We have to navigate somewhere we don't want to go. We think, if God were really with me, if I was really favored by God, there's no way that I would be where I am today. I want to spend our entire time this morning debunking this idea. Because 39 already shows us that despite where we might be, in spite of what the surroundings might look, no matter how bad the curve of the curveball seems to be, God does and will remain with us. If God weren't with me, I wouldn't be right here. Or could we consider that God does some of his best work in pits and in prisons? God does some of his very best work in my life and in your life in the seasons of our life that we like the least. When Joseph is thrown into a pit, it sets him up to be taken to Egypt. We talked in week 1. He would more than likely have never went to Egypt, not for any length of time anyway, had this not occurred. This was hundreds of miles away. He had no family there. He had, this was a pagan nation. There would have been no reason for Joseph to ever go to Egypt. Now, what Joseph doesn't know is in a relatively short time, considering, lifetimes and things, there's going to come a famine. There's going to come an opportunity where Joseph's going to rise through the ranks in Egypt to be the number 2 man, essentially, in the world. At that time, Egypt was the superpower. Joseph is the number 2 man in all of Egypt. The only place big enough with enough grain reserves to save not only Egypt, but all of God's people. Pharaoh wouldn't have done that just left to his own devices, but he knew that this is where Joseph was from. His family is going to eventually come and say, can you save us? Can you give us food? This is where God is working in the pits. It all started with Joseph being thrown a detour. Now we find him, he's going to interact in the prison with a couple members of Pharaoh's court. He's going to come in contact with a baker, and they're going to have dreams, and Joseph is going to interpret these dreams. Not only is Joseph in Egypt, an area he shouldn't be in, now he's thrown into prison, but he comes in contact with even a bigger player in the Egyptian government. People that are going to go to Pharaoh and ultimately kind of connect some dots. God does his best work in pits and in prisons. Now let's look in Genesis 40. This is where we kind of pick up. Joseph is thrown in prison. He's having to figure out how to interpret all this. And so he begins to meet some folks. And we're going to find that Joseph is essentially put in charge of the prison. The warden sees so much favor in Joseph that just like the exact same wording we read of Potiphar, that Potiphar never even thought about anything that Joseph was in charge of. The prison guard here is about the same way, that Joseph's going to rise in favor, be put in charge of all this, but he's going to interact with some folks and they're going to have some dreams. Let's read 1 through 8 together. Sometime after this is starting in verse 40, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and the baker committed an offense against the Lord, the king of Egypt. That's Pharaoh. Now, don't gloss over this. You think, cupbearer, baker, this sound like really elementary titles. But in essence, these two guys were about as close to Pharaoh as they could be. At that time, poison was a real threat, at least a perceived threat, that people wanted to take over the kingdom. They wanted to kill Pharaoh. So the cupbearer and the baker were in charge essentially of everything Pharaoh ate and everything Pharaoh drank. They ate it first and they drank it first to make sure that the Pharaoh wouldn't be poisoned. So whatever they did, more than likely it had something to do with that. But these guys were very tight with Pharaoh. They would have been at every meal, every conversation. More than likely they would have been close by. And Pharaoh was angry with the two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in prison where Joseph was confined. No coincidence there. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody. One night they both dreamed, the cupbearer, the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast?" They said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." Notice what Joseph says. Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me." This is setting up the scene where Joseph is going to interpret these dreams. Ultimately, he's going to say, when you guys go back to Pharaoh, remember me. Now they don't, and some more time passes. Joseph stays in prison all the while. But eventually, Pharaoh's going to start having some dreams. We're going to get to that in future weeks. And then the cupbearer and the baker are going to remember, isn't there that guy in prison that told us exactly what our dreams meant? And this is going to start this cycle that's going to connect Pharaoh and Joseph. Joseph is going to continue to rise in favor in Pharaoh's eyes, in God's eyes. It's going to lead to God utilizing Joseph to save his people. But friends, as great as all that sounds, do we remember that all of this started with a major detour? Prison, pits, areas that you and I would try our hardest to avoid. God says, these are the catalysts. This is how I'm going to propel you to where I need you to be. I want to focus in on this one phrase because this is really going to make the difference with regards to this whole story. They said, Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" Essentially, he's saying, isn't God the one that sets our paths? Isn't God the one that determines what our life will be? Isn't God the one that's going to give us meaning? Isn't God the one that's going to give us guidance when we don't know where to go? That's really what Joseph is saying. He's using their dreams as a way to illustrate a much larger idea. And I want us to spend just a few moments kind of extracting some of the nuggets of this. Because this phrase, "do not interpretations belong to God," don't get bogged down on just the dream side of this. I recognize that's an area that most of us have no connection with Joseph here. But the idea of being confused about what something might mean, being confused about what the future might hold for us, is a feeling that we share with Joseph, we share with the cupbearer, and we share with the baker. And Joseph's response is, doesn't all that belong to God to begin with? So our first point, if you're taking notes, our circumstances must be interpreted through God's lens and not our limited perspective. I want to repeat that because, again, this is essential to understanding Joseph's time in prison, but also understanding the way that he's able to succeed long after that and how you and I can navigate our detours. Our circumstances, the good, the bad, the ugly, when we fall and we're put in pits, when we're put in prisons undeservingly, our circumstances have to be interpreted through the lens of God. And that's why I focus so hard on that one phrase. Aren't the interpretations God's to begin with? That's essentially, isn't God's perspective on where we are right now the view that really matters? Because so often you and I, and I'm as bad as any, we look out, we see our world, and we have such a limited, short-sighted perspective where we think, man, how, again, if God were with me, I wouldn't be where I am. You and I can see such a tiny fraction of what God is viewing in a much larger sense. Think about in your life, and I'm sure you don't have to think very hard, the things that at the time seemed like a negative, but hindsight being what it is, you look back and you think, God was doing something here. I couldn't have gotten to where I am now without that bump in the road. My family couldn't be what it is today without this season of tough times and trial. Friends, we all have part of that in our story. Joseph had a really large measure, but you and I all have that to some degree. Our circumstances must be interpreted through God's lens and not through our limited perspective. Let's look in Isaiah 55. The prophet Isaiah talks about this to some degree. And really, Isaiah is just wanting to illustrate, just like, Joseph's talking about dreams, but in another sense, he's not. Isaiah is talking about a much larger sense here. He's saying, for my thoughts, this is God talking here. He's saying, for my thoughts are not your thoughts. Just listen to this. My thoughts are not your thoughts. Neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Friends, this kind of idea, it frustrates us from time to time because when we're in the season of detour, we want some of God's perspective. We want some clarity as to what we're doing. We want to have some idea of where we're going. But friends, in a much grander sense, we should rejoice and thank God daily that this is true. You and I don't have the capacity to be God, and we're thankful for that. God has the capacity to be God. God created all of us. God's got a plan that is bigger than any one of us. God guides us in a way that's better than anything we could put together. I know that it hurts in the moment. In the pit, in the prison, it's hard to look at that kind of verse and say, I'm so glad that God has kept me in the dark here. But do we recognize that most of the time, when you and I feel our most confusion, is when God is the most active? There's something about when God gets working. I heard it described one way, that when God gets working, he stirs up a lot of dust. When God gets moving, it stirs up a lot of dust, and all that dust goes to our mind, and usually those are the seasons where we see the very least. But God is doing the most good. This is true of Joseph's life, and it's true of ours. For my thoughts aren't yours. My perspective, my interpretation is not yours. Friends, are we interpreting not only the detours, not only the bad stuff, but all of our life through God's perspective? Are we viewing it through our own? 2 Corinthians, Paul's talking to the church at Corinth here, and he says something very similar. He says, as we look not to the things that are seen, not to the things that our eyes think we can perceive, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are not seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. God is working in the background. And when you and I are thrown a detour, I pray that we'll consider this. That perhaps we aren't looking at the whole picture. do we have the humility to recognize that you and I might not get it right away? We might not understand what God is doing this second, but we trust that we have a God big enough to guide us through all of it. Joseph did, and Joseph was blessed accordingly. God is more interested in developing our character than developing our comfort. Now, that's not to say that there's not going to be seasons of comfort. That's not to say that there's not great seasons, there's not mountain tops that are beautiful, that are worth savoring. It's just because even Joseph in his life, he has moments like that. I think he would say, in much later in Genesis 50, when his family comes and says, will you feed us? Will you save us? I mean, I think Joseph would view that as a mountaintop moment where he gets to reconcile with his brothers that he hasn't seen for decades, his father. He gets to save his family, not only his family, but God's people. I mean, there are moments of beauty. But do we recognize that that's not God's priority? God says, if I have to choose, I'm going to develop your character. I'm going to develop the things that's going to get you closer to me rather than develop the things that are going to make you comfortable. Again, sometimes God works and we get both. There are rare moments where we get them both. But more times than not, when God's kicking up that dust, when God's working through our detours, it's character development as opposed to comfort. Joseph sees this all throughout his life, which leads us to point number 2. God often trains us for greater things while we're in the midst of lesser things. God oftentimes is looking ahead. Again, this is where his perspective is so much greater than mine, than yours. When you and I are in the things that we consider to be a nuisance, we consider them to be detours in the very grandest sense of the word. We think we're in a pit, we're in a prison, we're in a road stop, we're just buying time. That's what our minds perceive. When we're in lesser things, God is training and preparing us for greater things. Do you recognize that Joseph, as great a man as he would turn out to be, was not ready to be with Potiphar or with Pharaoh when he first started in his story? When we met him as a 17-year-old boy, he was essentially bragging to his brothers about these dreams that he was having. He was really leaning into the fact that he was his father's favorite. I mean, Joseph had some growing up to do. Joseph wasn't ready to lead at 17. We don't know the exact time frame, but Joseph, wasn't quite ready to be with Pharaoh when he was with Potiphar. It took time to develop all the while. It took prison. It took being accused of some things that he didn't do. It took some time to develop the wisdom and the character to be ready to get to a point where God says, now I want to insert you in my grandest plan, which is going to be to connect you with Pharaoh, and ultimately you're going to save my people. But God often, and I say often, but it's awful close to always, trains us for greater things in the midst of lesser things. Joseph was being prepared all the while. And I'm certain, as great a man as he was, it wasn't like he was all the time just in a perfect perspective. I'm sure there were moments where he thought, God, what am I doing here? Why are you making me endure? Because again, and we're not going to read all this today, but even after he interpreted the dreams, even after he connected with the cupbearer and the baker, you would probably think, okay, now the story's really getting going. Now they're going to go back. They're going to bring Joseph with them. All's going to be happy. But do we recognize it eventually works that way? But there's some time between when Joseph interprets the first dream and when he's called in to interpret Pharaoh's dream. Most people will tell you that that's probably 2 to 3 years before this all really comes to fruition. We're impatient most often. We look to Scripture and we say, God, we're ready for it now. I'm ready for you to bless me now. I'm ready for you to get me out of the pit now. But God is working in the background all the while. How you and I respond to lesser things is telling how we'll respond to greater things. And I think this is partly what God does in the background, is he recognizes that how you and I react, how you and I connect to him, what you and I say, what we don't say with little things, is very telling of what you and I might do or say when given bigger things. So the point of all this is, why did Joseph need to spend time in prison? Why did Joseph have to go through the whole thing with Potiphar? Let's bring this all back around to our life. Friends, don't look over the lesser things, because more than likely this is God testing and training you and I to make sure that we're ready to go on to the big stuff. We don't pray for the lesser things. We don't think about the lesser things. We want God to give us the big from the get-go. But do we ever consider that God may be watching to see how we respond with the little stuff? I mean, we think about this with our children, right? This is basic parenting to some degree. And if it's good wisdom from an earthly perspective, how much greater is God going to be utilizing it? You and I, with our children, we give them a little responsibility to see, are they ready to handle that? Can we progress to bigger and better things? God does that with you and me. He says, Joseph, are you ready to commit yourself? And Joseph says, I am. How we respond to lesser things is telling of how we're going to do with bigger things. Look in Luke 16 and verse 10. Luke 16 and verse 10 says, one who is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. The idea behind this is the way our heart responds to little stuff is going to be the way our heart's going to respond to the big things. If you and I are faithful in little, we'll be faithful in much. If we're dishonest in little, we're going to be dishonest in much. God, this is as basic as it comes, and God says, are you ready to be trained in these moments? C.S. Lewis said, hardship often prepares an ordinary person for an extraordinary destiny. I think he's right. I think that's very much in line with what Joseph experienced. I think that's very much in line with what most of the New Testament disciples experienced, right? We just talked about it very briefly in our class this morning. They were fishermen. They were tent makers. They were tax collectors. I mean, they were everyday people that thought their lives were ordinary until Christ comes and says, I want you to be a fisher of men. I want you to quit fishing, and I want you to now be concerned with souls. They're regular, everyday people that are going to go through hardships, that are going to endure. Christ says, you got to count the cost. You got to take up your cross and follow me. Are you ready to immediately start? Are you ready to leave your father and your mother? Are you ready to leave your family for the sake of the gospel? Hardship often prepares regular, ordinary people. And don't miss this, me and you, regular, ordinary people to do amazing things. This is God utilizing detours for my growth, for your growth. And then lastly, as we end this morning, the length of our detour is often determined by the speed at which we're willing to grow. The length that God keeps us in a detour is almost always determined by the speed at which you and I are willing to grow. And what I mean by that is, how quickly are we willing to expand what we think we know? How quickly are we willing to adapt to what God is placing in front of us? How quickly are we willing to say, God, I might not have it all together. It may not be the way I'm thinking about it, but I'm willing to be molded to the way you would have me to be. The longer we resist that, I think Scripture shows us the longer God keeps us in our detours. Because again, it's a season of training. It's a season of testing. It's a season of God saying, if you're going to be resistant, if you're going to fight against me in the lesser things, you're going to fight against me in the bigger things. If you're going to fight me when you're in prison, you're certainly going to fight me when you go to be next to Pharaoh. And Joseph is kind of the inverse of that. He says, God, I'm faithful in prison. I'm faithful with Potiphar. I'm faithful through all of this. And I'll be faithful for whatever you have me to do. Joseph's an amazing man. Not perfect, but an amazing example of what it's like to go through life in ways that we don't expect, to be given a hand that we didn't necessarily want, but all the while to remain connected to God and be able to do incredible things. Next week, we're going to look at what happens when the baker and the cupbearer finally get back to Pharaoh, and Joseph kind of gets called up to the big leagues. Remember, all this while, he's sitting in prison, in the king's prison, no less. This was not a good place to be. But he's saying, Lord, I'm okay with your timing. And then he's going to finally get an opportunity to shine. And friends, you and I have that same chance. We wait, we endure the curveballs, the detours, until God is ready to utilize us for his purpose. This morning, if you're not a child of God, if you're not connected to him, certainly the way Joseph was, the way Christ talks about, why do you wait? God is ready to begin this training process. God is ready to help give the detours purpose. He's ready to put you into play, but it starts with your decision. If you've not made that choice, we hope you would this morning. Maybe you just need prayers or support. We'd love to help you with that also. If we can do anything for you, would you come let us know about it as we stand and as we sing?